Okay, so hello everyone, and this is going to be our last class. Um, Next Monday is the last day of class for St. Francis College, but of course we don't have classes on Mondays. Um, so we are going to finish off today, and I didn't want to leave you in the depths of despair and gloom after all the problems that we've talked about all the way through this class. So I wanted to just finish off by talking to you a little bit about environmental justice and environmental activism. And these are probably the most important things to finish off with, to open up to you the possibility that there are things that we can actually do, and that citizen voices are in fact incredibly important in driving ecological activism, environmental activism, and actually ensuring that change takes place on all levels. That is personal and in communities. It means in legislation and worldwide in global legislation, in global organizations. All of these things are driven by personal involvement at one level or another. Whether you decide to start recycling, you decide to plant a garden, you decide to start working for an organization as a volunteer, working as a career, becoming involved in government itself or in legislation or the law. All of these are avenues which are open to all of us if we are concerned about environmental problems. So let me just, here's one form of activism that I'm particularly fond of, and that is street art. Yes, this is actually painted. The fence is real, but the rest is painted. And I want to point out to you that we are besieged the whole time with information, and in the media, online, we continually see about the environmental problems, one after the other. And we are often left feeling that there is absolutely nothing that we can do, and that some sort of disaster is just around the corner. And this actually is recognized as producing anxiety around environmental issues. Now, I think everybody who has any information about the environment at all probably feels this to some extent or another. And some people feel it extremely keenly. And it has a name, it's called eco-anxiety. And it's not a disease by any means, but it reflects a heightened concern about the environmental emergencies that we're experiencing, and manifests itself as real anxiety. It's chronic fear of environmental cataclysm. And it arises because we're continually exposed to issues which seem irrevocable. It seems like we cannot stop them, and that they all have a bad ending. And that in turn leads to another condition, which is referred to as eco-grief. The two are really confused, can be conflated. But eco-grief is actually a real sense of grief, a sense of loss, when people notice that things are changing and that beloved things, maybe things that they didn't really realize were beloved until they're gone, are disappearing. And whether that is an actual species, or whether, for example, we notice we're having less snow in winter, and that betokens some sort of major change is taking place in the world around us, which leaves us feeling that our world is leaving us. And that can indeed produce these feelings of intense loss and grief. We should recognize these when they're happening at any level. Now, the background picture that I've given here is as my example of eco-grief. This is the Kauaian o'o bird. And this is the very last Kauaian o'o bird. It occurs high in the forests and the mountains of Kauai in Hawaii. This bird was very well known. He was a male, And for many years, he was the only one left. He was the only Hawaiian o'o. They recorded him every year until the late 1990s, I think it was. And finally, they went 1 year to record him, and he was gone. He spent all those years singing for a mate, and there was no mate for him to mate with to propagate the species. And when he died, he was the last. The only Hawaiian o'os, they used to be fairly common. The only Hawaiian o'os we have are stuffed ones in the museum. Now that is an example, just one species on a small island in the middle of the Pacific. And we wonder, does the loss of that bird actually mean anything? Does it have any relevance to the rest of the world? Well, it does, because I don't know if you felt sad when I told you this story, but I feel very sad telling that story. It affects us, and it affects us because it's symbolic. It is symbolic of change which is taking place on our planet at a very rapid pace. And although the loss of the Hawaiian o'o bird may not have an effect on the functioning of rainforests or temperate forests on the mainland or whatever, it is symbolic of the interconnectedness of all living things on our planet. And yes, the loss of the o'o bird is important. It's as important as the threatened loss of rhinos in Africa or any more charismatic species. So what do we do if we feel eco-anxiety and eco-grief to a lesser or a greater extent? What can it actually do to us, and what can we do about it? And the first thing is that if we just allow it to fester in us, it can lead to feelings of depression if you feel it intensely and you're aware of it the whole time, and yet you feel you can't do anything about it. That is almost the definition of depression, is being anxious about something and unable to change your circumstances. It can also lead to a feeling of paralysis. People feel overwhelmed. They look at all of the ecological problems of the world and they feel totally overwhelmed. And so they become paralyzed. They just become paralyzed. They don't know where to start. So they are left in a state where they can't do anything. One effect of eco-anxiety and eco-grief that you will meet constantly is affected indifference. That people will say, well, I can't do anything about it, so I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm not going to worry about it. I can't do anything, so I'm not going to worry about it. But that is affected indifference. And it simply means that the concern, the anxiety, and the grief have been suppressed. And that it's not doing anybody any good, neither the person nor the environment. Doing nothing, if these are real emotions to you, doing nothing about them is going to make them worse in the long run. But there are solutions. There are ways to address this. If you're concerned about the environment, if you experience some sort of sense of loss about the changes that are taking place, there are things that you can do. And in doing this class, you tackled one major way, and that was to get education, to have the knowledge. Not only throughout this class, we learned not only about the problems, we also learned about possible solutions that could be undertaken. The next thing to do is to have hands-on involvement. And your first line of involvement in ecological issues is to observe the world around you. Observe and appreciate. Learn, if you don't already, learn to derive joy from the environment. Because that way you will start to feel like you really are part of the environment. And then that even may move you then to actually become active in tackling these problems. Become an activist. Get involved and start to really make a difference. And you'll find that the eco-anxiety and the eco-grief may not go away, but you can manage it. And you can turn them to something positive and actually achieve something. So the most important concept that we need to get straight is the idea of environmental justice. Because environmental problems affect everybody on the planet. They affect us all. But they affect the most vulnerable amongst us particularly badly. So, for example, they affect the poor. They affect developing countries. They affect minorities much more than they do the people in power who are actually often creating the problems. And environmental justice means working for environmental success and just treatment and meaningful involvement of everyone, not simply doing things which will benefit one part of society, and not making decisions just from one part of society, but involving everybody, ensuring that it doesn't matter what income, race, what national origin you are, whatever, you are part, though everybody is part of the decision making, and that everybody benefits from improvements in human health and everything else. It's very important that we protect communities from disproportionate effects of environmental degradation, because this happens the whole time. Where, for example, do the power plants get built? And they get built in poor areas. They don't get built up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Where do the rubbish dumps go? They go into the marginal lands, where the marginal people often live. Where do we ship our trash to? We ship our trash to developing countries, for example, or else to communities that can't fight back, that feel they have no representation or do not know how their representation works. Environmental justice seeks to provide equitable access to a healthy, sustainable environment, and one which can resist environmental degradation and recover from the impacts of environmental degradation as quickly as any other community. So these, by the way, this lengthy paragraph here, these are the official pronouncements of the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States. This is their statement on environmental justice. The thing is, there it is, it stands there in writing, but it's up to us to ensure that it is fulfilled. And because those areas where it is not being fulfilled are often in the very communities which it pledges to protect. And these things are often hidden away. And one of the really important things to do is to empower individuals and empower communities so that they can actually gain knowledge, learn not only about their environment, learn what is wrong, learn what is due to them, and learn how to address power so that they can, in fact, affect things to a better status. Remember this. This is the United States Constitution, but whatever country you are in, this is true whether there is written into your constitution or not. The people have the power. Those in charge only enjoy the power that is given to them, that is allowed to them. No matter what they tell us, no matter what the corporation tells you, no matter what the wealthy oligarch tells you, they only have the power that we give them. And when we decide to limit that power, when we decide that things should be different or be run differently, then mysteriously things begin to change. So I want to do two things. I wanted to give you, first of all, an idea of some of the power that ordinary citizens have, and tell you a couple of the success stories, which are all, and tell you how they were citizen-driven. And then I wanted to show you some organizations, well-known organizations, which are working. But in your reading list and everything, I've also given you resources to go and find organizations that might speak to you, that you could work with. So we'll start off here in the United States with one of the most important events in the environmental movement. And this was the publication in 1962 of a book called Silent Spring. Unfortunately, nowadays it's seldom read, which is a great pity, because it was a historical and classic document. It was written by Rachel Carson. And Rachel Carson had become extremely concerned about the bird populations in the United States. And all of the data, all of the information suggested that something very serious was happening in the bird populations of the United States. And she took one of the things that was really amazing, she took as an example, was the bald eagle. That the bald eagle's population was plummeting all over the United States. It used to be a common bird, and it was plummeting all over the United States, despite the fact that it's the emblem of the United States. And she, through researching, other people did the research, but she synthesized work, and they came to realize that the bald eagle and many other birds of prey as well, were dying off because they were suffering from pesticide poisoning. The pesticide in question was DDT, extremely powerful, very good pesticide because it has low toxicity for human beings. But the problem was that it is not metabolized in nature. And so if you cast your mind back, I told you about with the ecological pyramids, how pesticides and toxins can get concentrated up to the predators at the very top. That is what was happening with the bald eagles. And the effect of the DDT accumulating in these birds was that they were laying eggs which were too thin, and the parents were smashing the eggs when they attempted to roost them. And so they had year after year after year of failed broods. And as the older birds started to die off, probably also affected by the pesticide, the population crashed. Many other bird populations, which were insectivorous, which ate insects, were eating DDT along with the insects, and they were dying off too. And that's where this very terrifying title for the book, Silent Spring, came to be. And this book caused an absolute furor. It really spoke to people because many people, without even realizing it, had been seeing birds disappear from their backyards. And they didn't perhaps even really notice until it was pointed out to them. And then they became horrified. Then it became clear that DDT was spreading throughout nature. It was found in watercourses. It was affecting frogs. It was affecting fish. It was affecting many, many, many different organisms. And it was banned. And immediately DDT was banned, the situation began to improve. And of course, nowadays, you can even see bald eagles in New York. They have recovered to such an extent that they are widely seen. This was one of the first great successes of the environmental movement. Now, there are complications to this because DDT was actually a very useful insecticide, particularly in dealing with malaria. And it's one of the reasons why malaria was beaten back all over the United States. Many other pesticides since then have, of course, been synthesized and are being used. and they themselves now, it is turning out, are having deleterious effects. That is one of the reasons why there is a collapse in insect populations, and now again a collapse in bird populations. So this is something, first of all, was an immense success, but now it needs renewed activism. It needs renewed science and renewed activism to readdress the problem. In 1975, the United States became the first country to mandate catalytic converters. This was actually had been promulgated several years earlier, and car manufacturers were given an ultimatum that they had to reduce a toxic gas emissions such as carbon monoxide from car engines, which they did. I told you the story before. There is a secondary part to the story, because cars still were allowed to use leaded gasoline, which was very, very toxic and released into the atmosphere. But the car manufacturers, first of all, invented the catalytic converter and conformed to the requirements of legislation. But the catalytic converters didn't last long because the lead in the gas degraded them. So car manufacturers themselves then developed the technology to remove to try and remove lead, very unsuccessfully, and they instead began to agitate for legislation to be passed to ban lead. They themselves were unable to deal successfully with the lead problem, so they handed it over to the legislators, and very, very quickly, lead was banned, because now industry, the initial changes to exhaust were citizen-driven. The later changes were driven by car manufacturers acting, by corporations realizing that economics demanded legislation change. 1987, this is the Montreal Protocol, and this was in response to tremendous amount of citizen activity and activism surrounding the issue of the ozone layer. And by that stage, science had shown that there was this ozone hole opening up, and the ozone layer all over the world was weakening. But it wasn't, it was scientific agitation that led to citizen action demanding that world governments actually do something about this. And legislation was passed on a global scale to limit the emission, to limit the pollution of the atmosphere by chlorinated fluorocarbons. That is in our previous lecture. You heard that about our module on air pollution. So these are, we've already got these three things. You heard me say over and over again: citizen, citizen, citizen. It's citizen involvement that drives these things. Here's a marvelous one from my continent, and this is Wangari Maathai. She is founder of an organization called the Green Belt Movement. She has since passed away, but she was the first Black woman to receive the Nobel Prize, and she was a person, she was not a scientist or anything. She just became extremely concerned because of deforestation in her home country, which is Kenya. The deforestation arose because poor communities depended on wood for their fuel, and they had decimated forests throughout Kenya. And she began this organization, which actually did two things. It's famous for having planted thousands, a gazillion trees, now all over Africa, and especially East Africa. But there is another aspect to their work, and that is to work with technology developers to develop efficient cooking systems, efficient stoves, so that people don't resort to using forests and woodlands for their fuel. Very, very wonderful person, and the Queen of Africa. So in 2008, under enormous societal pressure, the governments were dragged kicking and screaming to pass legislation to regulate greenhouse gases. Governments still hate this. They still hate it because it has such enormous economic implications. They very frequently just regard it as being a brake on economic growth and development, because it's much easier to fund economic development if you use cheap fuel. And we have abundant cheap fuel in the form of coal and oil, but we're killing our planet in order to do so. And so we may end up being a very, very, very rich, dead planet, but that's not going to help anybody. The governments worldwide were very reluctant to address this issue, and it is citizen activity. This is the concern of the populations themselves, which forced them to begin to address them. And the first major legislation in a developed country to address it was 2008, and this is the United Kingdom's Climate Change Act. That's the very first, believe it or not, as late as that. 2008 is not that long ago. We've known about this problem for nearly 50, 60 years. And but this was a seminal event because it led other countries to see that they needed to promulgate legislation, but also showed them how to do it. And they did so, but then countries got together and did a global legislation. And that is the Paris Climate Treaty, signed by 196 different countries, agreeing to try, that's the operative word, to limit the global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. And we're already, by the way, at 1.5. But the ultimate target was 1.5. If all of the legislation, everything goes right, we may hold it below 2, and then be able to improve things so that there is a reduction over the time, over the decades. But this is still, as you know, we've talked about it extensively, this is still a pressing and ill-addressed problem. And the reliance of countries on fossil fuels, especially large countries like the United States and China, these are things which are going to require citizen action, citizen attention, continually contacting, continually driving legislators, continually driving companies to reduce their use of fossil fuels for this to succeed. Okay, so who's an activist? Well, anybody. An activist is anybody who works to create change. And it can be the range of things that people do is absolutely breathtaking. If you want to become involved, there are all sorts of things that you can do, everything. Art, I think art is one of the most important. I think this is a field, for example, where the mainline artists scarcely address environmental problems. But young artists, especially street artists, creative writers, all of these people, they are the ones who are addressing it. And they are the ones who, as they become well known, should try to keep their idealism and stay on the topic of environmental degradation, because that is very often their voice. Their voice is really important. You can write letters to newspapers, politicians. Do not let anybody tell you, oh, you're just a keyboard warrior. If that is what you are, do it well. Do it well. And don't let anybody tell you it's not important. It is hugely important, especially to politicians. Political campaigning and lobbying, this is something I would not do myself, but I greatly admire people who do get involved. The only reason I wouldn't like to do it because I just become so irritated with the other people. But so you have to know your personal strengths. You have to know where your own weaknesses are when you become involved. But many people are extremely good at this and love political work on the issue. Arranging public meetings, arranging groups, arranging public meetings. These are very often the seeds of tremendous change, especially at community level. Economic activism. Now this begins to become contentious, but we cannot deny the power of economic activism, like boycotts. And first of all, boycotting businesses which are not adhering to good environmental standards. But also, we mustn't forget to patronize businesses, especially things like the farmers' markets, especially things like small businesses, which don't depend on industrial processes, which pollute the air, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to be sure that businesses and enterprises which have no environmental responsibility know that we are not going to deal with them. We're going to hurt them economically unless they change their ways. But it's equally important to reward those who are doing the right thing. You'll know that rallies, street marches, strikes, sit-ins, hunger strikes, all of these things, the establishment and particularly establishment media do not like these things. They don't like to see the order of things get affected, but there is tremendous power in these, especially where they are nonviolent. And these are certainly things that are important from another point of view, and that is these are all things which will make you feel that you are part of a group. Many other activities, writing letters, even attending a meeting, for example, you may feel very isolated. But if you're going to rallies, you're going to street marches, these sorts of things, you feel like you are with fellow citizens. You feel like you are dealing with people who understand what you are talking about and understand your eco-anxiety or your eco-grief. Guerrilla tactics and direct action, believe it or not, are immensely powerful. They're for the brave, though. They're for those who are willing to take risks, but their importance cannot be understated. They can really bring issues to the attention of the general populace like nothing else. And they have a strange way of focusing the attention of the corporations or whatever who have the actions performed against them. Excuse me. Oh, those are just for fun. These are old environmental posters. This is one of the very first Earth Day posters, I think from 1972 or something like that. German post. This is actually poster was from Germany, but here are the different languages. This was on water pollution. This is a rather gloomy one, also from an early Earth Day, I believe. And this is an old 1970s rainforest, Save the Rainforest poster. This, I have to tell you, Save the Rainforest is one of the least successful of the environmental activities, very, very sadly. But the reason for that is it is so tied up with politics that the rainforests are sitting in developing countries, and they have a point in saying why are rich countries which have already polluted the earth and everything else, why do they come along and tell us we can't use our resources which we have in the rainforests? And the answer to that is rich countries need to make saving the rainforest a resource. We should be paying those countries for all of the ecological benefits that the forests give us. And then we might be able to really affect some real change in the way in which those forests are exploited. Okay, so the term climate justice, apart from environmental justice, but climate justice is one of the things which we recognize as a special aspect of environmental justice. And first of all, again, as in all these environmental issues, there are disproportionate impacts of climate change on the low income and marginalized communities. They are the ones who suffer the most from the bad effects. Just think of one simple thing, and that is, as the planet warms, we have to deal with hotter and hotter weather. But who owns air conditioners? And what countries produce enough electricity and have the electricity infrastructure to provide the electricity to run hundreds of thousands of air conditioners? Air conditioners are a feature of rich countries, not of poor countries. And yet poor countries very often are the ones who are suffering the most from the effects of climate change, of global climate change. So what we need to start thinking of, realizing, is that what is happening in the developing countries, or what is happening to poor marginalized communities, is actually happening to all of us. It's just that some of us are able to escape some of the effects. So for example, the countries which are contributing the most carbon to the atmosphere, carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, are the ones which are most able to afford the changes that are needed to try and avoid global warming. But the countries, the poorer countries, are suffering the same effects. The atmosphere doesn't, the carbon-rich atmosphere doesn't just sit over the rich countries. The carbon-rich atmosphere is distributed over the whole planet, and its effects are distributed over the whole planet. And is it fair for us to ask the developing countries, the poorer countries, to pay for something which in fact we are causing? That is just a simple example, but a very, very, very complex one, if you think about the implications of what I just said. All of the effects of global warming, the increased weather events, severe weather events, flooding, droughts, all of these things, they affect developing countries far, far more than they do the rich developed countries. The effects are felt because those countries are already on a margin. They're already having to work really hard just to stay where they are. And any small, even a small setback can be disastrous. Whereas in a rich country, we have much more room to play with in the event of a severe weather event. We have the insurance companies. We have the wherewithal. We have FEMA. We have all of these things in the United States, for example, to deal with a disaster situation. Those things are not available to a poor farmer in Bangladesh who's had 3 years of drought because of global warming. Okay, so the University of California drew up these 6 pillars of climate justice, and they have this logo. And here I'll discuss them briefly with you. But if you want to, I have given you a link to the University of California publication, which explains this more fully. I'll just do it really, really briefly. But this says for climate justice. But in actual fact, the same concepts apply to any environmental justice. Whatever issue you are dealing with, these things have application. The first thing they point out is that climate justice requires just transition. Now that I hinted at already as the previous slide, and that is as we transition from fossil fuel-based economies, for example, to regenerative, renewable energy-based systems, that in actual fact is expensive. And a just transition would require that poor countries should be as able, or poor communities should be as able to withstand that transition as anybody else. And one of the ways in which to do that is to ensure that there is employment provided in the new sectors, that these new technologies provide employment and income to people that they are supposed to benefit. I'll give you a simple example here, and that is here in the United States, in the rural Appalachians, places like that, where coal mining is a major source of income. Those coal mines, we're calling on them to shut those mines down. And that means a loss of income for tens of thousands of people in those areas. And that loss of income has enormous societal and political effects. And it's one of the reasons why it has been so hard for us to move away from coal as a source of fuel. But if we are able to take those communities and give them employment in renewable energy sectors, then we may be able to move away from coal a lot quicker and be able to deal with them justly as we do so. So the second pillar of climate justice is social, racial, and environmental justice. And again, this recognizes that there are disproportionate impacts of climate change. I will add any environmental degradation on the low income by the people, communities of people of color, third world countries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it very often impacts people who are least responsible for the problem. And this needs to be recognized. And it needs to be recognized that the countries, corporations, and communities that are causing the problem have a responsibility to these other communities. Indigenous communities who are living particularly in their original habitats, etc., are particularly at risk of environmental degradation, and particularly at risk of economic exploitation of environments on which they are absolutely dependent. Very often, these indigenous communities, it's not just that they hunt there, they grow local foods or whatever. These are often, their environments are often the lifeblood of the community. They do not see themselves often as being separate from their environment. If you destroy their environment, effectively, you destroy them. You destroy their communities. And when in all of these situations, the indigenous peoples have to receive particular consideration. And the effects of global warming, again, effects of general ecological degradation, affect these indigenous peoples with particular force. And this needs to be recognized. And one of the ways to address this is to empower these indigenous communities. Stop looking at them as being relics. Stop looking at them as being the special cases. They are part of the human family as much as the people sitting in the boardroom of Pepsi Cola. They're part of the human family, and they're a vital part of our human family because they're our greatest example of how human beings ought to be relating to their environment. They deserve special recognition, and their ways of life deserve preservation. They need to be given the means to preserve their way of life and improve it as they see fit. If they wish to change it, let it be them who make the decision to change, not force change upon them. The next thing is to ensure that communities live in resilient circumstances. Now, what that means is that the communities should be able to withstand at least temporary changes to their environment. No community can withstand disastrous long-term changes to their environment. But for example, the resilience measures a community's ability to recover from something like a flood, an earthquake, or drought, or anything like that. And the ability of the community to show that resilience is very often a measure of, first of all, their overall wealth, their ability to have savings, not necessarily just in money, but savings in terms of seed, perhaps, or ability to draw resources, gain resources in order to recover from these events. Many of these communities lack that. They lack money. They lack extra resources because they live a hardscrabble existence. And they lack, above all, they lack contact with the wider community. They lack political clout. They don't have access to their MPs or whatever to look after them. And here is an area where activism becomes very important, because very often these kinds of communities need, first of all, they need education. Second of all, they need intercession. They need people to intercede for them, at least on a temporary basis. And this is an area of activism which is tremendously important. But first, you've got to know about those communities. And you have got to have their trust in order to work with them, and then link them up, educate and link them up with the relevant authorities. Now, adaptation is a little bit different. Adaptation is the ability of the community to withstand repeated exposures to the ill effects of some ecological degradation. In this case, they're talking particularly about climate. So for many of these communities, the droughts, or the alternating droughts and floods, etc., these are not one-off events. These are things which they can expect to be happening with increasing frequency. Adaptation is change in the way in which they do things, so that their communities can survive over a long-term basis as these things happen. Last thing is that the climate justice seeks to change the way in which we are interacting with our environment, not only in terms of industry or global climate change or whatever, but in the very structures of the things of which we do. For example, that we should move away from things like huge hyper farms with monocultures. We should move away from systems which degrade forests so that we can put up palm oil plantations, or level rainforests so that we can grow soybeans or ranch cattle there. We need to move away from these things and start to work with nature, and start reforming and researching how can farms, for example, how can agriculture work differently? How can agriculture, instead of imposing so heavily on the natural systems, how can agriculture start to work with nature? So, for example, they look to natural solutions. We talked a bit about regenerative farming, those sorts of things. This I didn't talk about permaculture, but that if you are interested in this topic, look up what permaculture is. We should be using the opportunity to restructure our forests, regenerate our forests, provide employment by doing so, and just restructure the farm itself so the farm becomes a diverse ecosystem. We don't need to model it entirely on a rainforest or whatever, but use those ecological principles of diversity to limit, so that we can limit the amount of pesticides and fertilizer and everything else we have to drench it with. So this is an area of active research, of moving these systems towards natural systems, which will reward us because we don't have to actually put so much into them in order to get them to work. Okay, so having preached to you all this time, I just want to show you a couple of different organizations that you might be interested in. And so these are only a few. I have given you in the readings, I have given you some other resources to lots of other organizations that you could become part of in small or big ways. All of these organizations, the very first thing you'll see when you go to their websites, you'll see a banner saying, please donate. They all need money. And so if that's what you want to do, then by all means do it. But there are many other ways to be involved with these organizations. Now, this is one of the great ones, the older environmental organizations, and this is Greenpeace. And Greenpeace is a wonderful organization, very, very diverse organization all over the world. The current chairman actually is a South African, Indian South African. And they work on a wide range of issues all over the world, and they have all sorts of levels of engagement, from donating all the way up to community involvement and everything else. Definitely worth taking a look at. They work principally on these three areas: climate and energy, biodiversity, and social economic. They are very, very socially active, and they are very much direct action oriented. So you can expect, if a company is polluting a river, you can expect to see Greenpeace activists outside that company protesting or going collecting the river water and pouring it on the chairman's desk or whatever. But they work also very much with government, and they are a well-respected organization. Excuse me. So here are some of their direct actions. I'm always amused, and that is part of their appeal. Just excuse me one minute. This is part of their appeal. These direct actions often have a tinge of humor to them as well, and a bit of a poke in the eye very often to authority. I particularly like this one over the White House. They somehow got up there and put up this banner. So here's another one. This is a very gallant, very courageous organization. This is Sea Shepherd. I believe it arose out of association with Greenpeace, but I'm not entirely sure. Sea Shepherd, as its name suggests, is particularly concerned with issues of the ocean, and their initial focus was on whaling. When they started, whaling was still quite widespread, but they were one of the organizations which led to an almost complete ban on whaling. And they direct a lot of attention still to the few nations that do still whale. Those are Japan, that's the biggest one, and Iceland, and I believe Norway as well. But whaling has been reduced magnificently. You'll remember the graph we saw of the tragic collapse of the blue whale population to very, very near extinction. And Sea Shepherd were one of the organizations which led to a complete ban on blue whale whaling. So they are also a very much direct action. If you're interested in getting on a ship and going out and doing something brave and spectacular and effective, Sea Shepherd might be the organization that you want to have a look at. But there are also some other ways that you can interact with Sea Shepherd. Go to their website. There is a Get Involved button, but there's also a button saying, do you want to join our cruise? So one of our crews. So you could do that as well. Here you are. Here's a Join Our Crew button. And there, I think I've also got a little video somewhere. You will see Sea Shepherd in action. Very famous for doing things like this. They have been interacting with a Japanese whaling vessel. You'll notice it says here on the side, research. Well, this is a bit of a con. Under the international whaling agreements, these nations are allowed to continue whaling as long as it is for research, and they can still sell the meat that they harvest. Sea Shepherd regularly used to go out, and they would scoot back and forth in front of the ships. They would go and scare off whales that these ships were busy making their way towards. And here you can see they sprayed blood red paint all over the vessel. So they very much direct action, but extremely courageous and effective. That's the key. Climate Justice. This is an organization that you might not have heard about. It's not always in media, not that high profile, but a very, very good organization. And Climate Justice, as its name suggests, this is their dedicated focus is on fossil fuels and removing fossil fuels from use globally. And they are very much community-based, and they organize many local actions as well as interactions with the politicians, and doing community awareness is one of their important areas of focus. So here is a exposition of their rationale: social media campaigns, grassroots organization, collective public action to oppose new coal, oil, and gas projects, and support of clean energy solutions. So there are many, many ways to get involved with them. There are local groups that you can access. So just go to, if this interests you, go to their webpage and you can follow up on that. And so they are very active, very good organization, and they always have, you can look and see that they have continual recent updates on actions that they have undertaken. Here's one, April 18th. And this is a campaign, the utilities campaign that they are part of, trying to change the way in which utilities are billed in the United States, which in the billing of utilities encourages the use of fossil fuels through strange economic flim-flam, which they are attempting to change. Here are other things that they have done recently. So this is a very active organization. The last one that I mentioned is this organization called Ocean Conservancy, another of the ocean interest groups. And they particularly are interested in fisheries. And for those of you who perhaps were alarmed at what I told you about the way fisheries are run, this may be one of the organizations that you would be interested in. Sea Shepherd now, the one I talked about before, also has an interest in fisheries, and they direct action at illegal fishing boats and illegal fishing fleets. They find out where they are and they go and disrupt them. They cut their nets. They do all sorts of things to make it. Their aim is not to provoke. Their aim is to make it economically unviable for these groups to be doing what they are doing. But Ocean Conservancy also has an interest in sustainable fisheries. Here are some of their other interests. Microplastics, you may have, I did refer to this, but you may not remember that plastics often break up in the ocean, but are still there and cause problems. That is a particular interest. And they are one of the few organizations which are addressing microplastics. But they also have other interests, oil companies, etc., etc. This last one that I'm going to tell you about is Earth Justice. Now, this is for those of you that I know that there are some of you who may be interested in legal careers. And that is a wonderful way to go. It really, really is. You can effect enormous change by becoming involved in legislation and becoming a lawyer specializing in environmental law. And Earth Justice, if that is your interest, Earth Justice may be the organization for you to look at, because they are particularly engaged in public interest environmental law. So they very often are an organization that will draft legal briefs, draft legislation on behalf of citizen organizations and things like that, for presentation to legislators or presentation in Congress or whatever. But also they will become involved in legal cases, which very often end up as high as the Supreme Court. There are environmental cases before the Supreme Court this year, for example, which Earth Justice is probably involved in somewhere along the line. So their mottos, we go to court to defend the planet and its people. That is exactly what they do. And this is a very good organization, particularly if you are interested in the law. So you go to their page, you'll see that there are various actions that they undertake, including street activity, including things, the traditional kind of activism things, but their particular interest is in the law. So I end with this slide, this is actually drawn from a statement of the Earth Day organization. Remember that yesterday, April 21st, I say April 22nd, sorry, was Earth Day. The Earth Day organization exists as an environmental organization, although its Christmas Day is Earth Day. Nonetheless, they operate throughout the year and do undertake many other activities as well. But I'll just read this because it is exemplary. They have a vision for change. Our world needs transformational change. It is time for the world to hold sectors accountable for their role in our environmental crisis, while also calling for bold, creative, and innovative solutions. This will require action at all levels, from business and investment to city and national government. And this is where you come in. You. As an individual, you yield real power. You do. You have real power in your hands and in your brain, especially, and in your voice. As an individual, you yield real power and influence as a consumer, as a voter, and a member of a community that can unite for change. Do not underestimate your power. When your voice and your actions are united with thousands or millions of others around the world, we create a movement that is inclusive, impactful, and impossible to ignore. Every Earth Day can drive a year of energy, enthusiasm, and commitment to create a new plan of action for our planet. I think that's something that we could all sign on to. So that is the last that I have to say for this lecture, but I just want to explain, there is no student worksheet for you this week, but there is a discussion group, and I ask you please to spend some time thinking about that discussion group before you contribute, and try to make your contribution relevant, and try to make it something from the heart, as well as being informative for other people. And I thank you all very much. I know that these asynchronous online classes can have a bit of an impersonal feel to them, but I have kept a careful watch over what is happening, particularly in the discussion groups. And I greatly appreciate the fact that so many of you have worked so hard really to get involved, and so many of you seem to have taken a tremendous interest in what you're studying, which is the most important thing of all, probably more important than your grades. And I hope that you take things from this class and carry on learning on your own as time goes forward. And with that, I'll just remind you, we will have a quiz on Sunday. That will be obviously be the last quiz, and that will be on air pollution. There will not be a quiz on this section, but we will then have an exam, a final exam. Now, I'm not sure when that exam, I need to check when that exam has been set, but I will get back to you. We may well be able to set the exam earlier than the date that is set, and get it over and done with. Okay, so I wish you all the best, all of you, and good luck with the final exam. And I hope that I get to teach you in person someday. Thank you very much.